following up a debut album that ultimately was my favorite album of the year that it was released in 2020. Man, that's a high bar to set. So where do we land on the sophomore follow-up album? Do we get into the sophomore slump, or do we have a breaker of the mold? Let's find out. Zio, Truewaves by Zio. So Zio is as I mentioned, it's a relatively new progressive rock band. This is their second release from the United Kingdom. They're kind of being labeled as neo-prog, but I kind of consider them more of like a modern, more electronic prog in that sense. Lots of use of synthesizers, lots of use of textured overtones, a little bit more production work than a lot of other progressive rock bands have. And it was all born of the brainchild of Jimmy Palagrossi, I believe is how you pronounce his name, on drums and percussion, who got his start with Karnataka, which is one of my favorite, more folk-inspired progressive rock bands. If you haven't heard The Gathering Light from Karnataka, it's an absolute masterpiece, and I think you should really go and check it out. They put out, as I mentioned, in 2020, their debut album of Flower Torania, I think is how you pronounce it. This really interesting concept album between video games and sci-fi, and it's this big kind of like space odyssey in the digital video game landscape. And as I mentioned, it grew to be my favorite album of 2020 and is still one of my favorite albums so far of this decade. You know, and one of the things that really sets it apart was having this massive amount of energy to create these stand out singable choruses that I can't help but get along with, you know. I like the flirtation of different styles as well, you know, and, you know, the symphonic modern neo-prog that we have out there is just overabundance of marrying a bunch of different genres and different flavors. So on Flower Torania, we had flavors of metal, we have flavors of pop, we had flavors of like indie, kind of all wrapped together into this one package. And I was really excited to see where they would go from here, you know, where they would go with Truewaves. And Truewaves kind of continues the whole concept album, and there's a lot more individuals in this one. You know, I feel as though their budget, so to speak, is a little bit higher. So Jimmy is, joined once again by Mark Fassi on guitars and Oliver Caston on keyboards and Haley Griffiths on vocals. And Haley is one of the individuals that came from Karnataka. Her vocals you can like pinpoint out of a group. But I think where this album for me starts to waver a little bit is something that I noticed with a lot of newer prog bands that start to get a little bit of notoriety, especially with their debut album, start to reach out and get a lot of guest appearances, and they want to get those individuals for the name recognition and the brand recognition, but don't quite know what to do with them outside of getting that person to sing on their song or getting that person to put a solo on. So you have some masters in the modern prog world like Eric Gillette from Flying Colours and the Neil Morse Band, John Mitchell from Frost and Lonely Robot, Corvex, Majda and Miranda, Gabriel Agordo. And so all of these individuals, specifically on the vocals, they come in and it removes a little bit of the flow because they have very pronounced and very recognizable voices. So there are a couple moments on this album where I'm listening through and all of a sudden I'm like, oh, you know, that's John Mitchell singing, or oh, that's Eric Gillette singing. And it kind of removes a little bit of the flow, a little bit of the continuity of the storyline that they're putting down with Truewaves. I feel like for certain individuals, they at least know how to use their voice, their singing in order to really elevate the music. Like when Corvix comes in, it sounds really interesting and very, like, it adds a little bit of a fun dynamic to that. When Magda and Miranda come in, their two harmonizations of their vocals play a lot of fun together. The one thing though that I will admit is I know I put a lot of expectation on this album, and I know that going in, because when I first listened to it, much like with Haken's Fauna, I was kind of disappointed. You know, there was a lot of music going on, but nothing really stuck. There wasn't anything super groundbreaking on it. There wasn't like that that meaty chorus work that we had from Flower Toria. We didn't have a lot of that like really fun aspect that I was really hoping for. It felt like a little bit of a watered down version of their debut album that I wasn't as excited for. But now that I've had a little bit of time with it, now that I've had a little bit of grounding with it, I'm able to kind of push my expectations to the side and listen to the music as it is on a whole. And there are still some pretty fun times on this album. Untainable, which has the Eric Gillette, I believe, on the vocals on it, opens up the album in that more heavy standpoint that we had from their debut. Provides a little bit more of that oomph, a little bit more of that gusto about it. It's a little bit on the shorter side at just under 4 minutes, and we've already had kind of one setup track with the opening track, the title track of Truewaves, which is just kind of the synthesized vocalization of Truewaves and introducing the concept. Then we come into another about minute and a half track after Unattainable of Amused, which is a pretty good track, you know. Hayley Griffiths is opening this up, and her voice is just so dang good, and I love the synthesized production that's on this one, and what I really like is that it flows directly into Space Heater, but I feel as though these two tracks really should have been one track for about 5.5 minutes rather than the split up that it was, because Space Heater has what I loved about the debut album from Zio, being that very energetic, very fun, very bumpin', very almost pop-induced aspect of it. I love the kind of get up and go that we have to it. But then we come into the fifth track of Living Behind, and I'm not as big of a fan of this one. This one is a little bit of a dud in my sense. Like, I'm feeling like a Beatles or an ELO kind of flavor of it, and it doesn't quite work with what they're kind of putting down. Like, I like the vocalizations that we have on there. You know, I like the harmonizations that are put down, but I don't know. Since we've had maybe about, I don't know, over about 10 minutes of like some pretty solid stuff, it felt like I was running into a brick wall with this track. And then we come into Above the Wheels, which I'm still kind of on the fence for. Like, I like the build-ups and I like the music that we have on here, but this is where John Mitchell comes in, and it feels like a Lonely Robot track rather than a Zio track, and I don't know how I feel about that, because it is, you know, it's starting off the second half of the album, and I just felt a little bit drawn out of it, you know. John Mitchell does a great job within his vocalizations and his singing styles. You know, he definitely hits the nail on the head in that sense. But I was kind of hoping for a little bit more of a Zio track rather than a Lonely Robot track. And then we come into a shorter track of The Lonely Diamond Part 1, and it's fine. I wonder if we're going to get a Lonely Diamond Part 2 soon. You know, it's a pretty fun, just, you know, electric guitar instrumental. It doesn't really add too much to the track or to the album. And it does kind of take a while for the music to kind of pick back up again, because Close takes a little bit of time to get started. And I'm all good for a slow burn track, especially if there's a really good payoff. But, you know, at 5.5 minutes, by the second minute mark, I'm like, okay, we're starting to get a little bit of the get up and go, a little bit of that oomph back. And we come into I Hear Them Whistling, which is the big 9-minute track on this one, the longest track on here. And again, this track takes a little bit of time to get going. It's got a really nice build up to it. And I like how this is a little bit of a synthesization of the album overall. You know, it has a lot of the different singers all kind of on this track. And I like how it builds itself up. And around the midpoint of this track, I like how it really starts to build itself up, and we get a lot more of that metal aspect of it. But I just feel as though the big climax of this track, the big crescendo, I don't know, it didn't quite pay off as much as I was hoping. Like, we have this really great soaring guitar works, we have this really interesting crescendo, but it kind of then peters off, and the final track of End Waves kind of summarizes the album again. You know, it's a really nice bookend, but at the end of the day, I wasn't all that excited about that. So yeah, in the end, Truewaves, as I mentioned, was a little bit of a letdown, but the more that I've listened to it, the more I've started to warm up to it. You know, I'm not as disappointed about this album as I originally was when I first listened to it. I'm hoping as the year goes on, the album begins to provide a little bit more, but it's still a little bit of a disappointment, especially after as much as I love their debut album. But I mean, these things happen. I do think that the boys are stepping up their game in terms of their musicianship. They're trying new things. They're getting a lot more features on it. But I feel as though, as I mentioned at the beginning, they're leaning a little too much on those influences instead of building up the tracks themselves first. So in the end, I will at least say that Truewaves from Zio is still one I would ultimately stream. As I mentioned, I hope that this album gives me a little bit more as I listen to it. The more I do listen to it, the more I enjoy it. And as I'm in the album, there are moments that definitely bring themselves forward as being really, really good. As I mentioned, Unattainable and Space Heater are probably my favorite tracks off of this album. The rest of the album, I think, kind of wavers a little bit to try to find the point. So, yeah, it's fine. I would recommend checking it out, but it's not the run, don't walk that was their debut. So that's where I'm going to leave Truewaves. I want to know what you guys think about this album. Did you love it? Did you hate it? Whatever you thought, please let me know by commenting down below. Because that's all I've got for you guys today. So thank you all so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.